Can you see my desktop, everyone? Just use this. Yeah, great. So guys, my name is Sukesh Marla, and basically I'm a trainer. I'm a part of Mumbai Techie Group as well. Mumbai Techie Group is a Mumbai user group. We usually conduct trainings and free trainings actually every month in Microsoft, and we will be having our next session on 27. So if you want, you can be the part of it. Okay, you can visit mumbaitekigroup.wordpress.com. So here we regularly put the detail about that. And other than that, about me, basically I'm working as a technical lead for more than 7 years, and from last 3 years I'm working as a trainer. I do trainings on MVC, WCF, design patterns, MSBI, and many other topics. So today, as a part of this webinar, I'm going to talk about two important topics about MVC, that is asynchronous controller and ViewModel. So basically, I don't know how many of you are new to MVC, how many of you are already good in MVC. So let me put a poll and let me confirm that. Okay, let me put a poll. Are you new to MVC? Yes, no. Just participate in this poll so that I can come to know that if you guys are new to MVC or no. Oh, is it? So it looks like most of the guys, so you don't know any MVC, right? Oh, there are 8 guys who are completely new to MVC. That is almost 80% of the crowd are new to MVC. So is it, means I don't think starting with asynchronous controller and ViewModel will work anymore. So I believe we should start with basic. So let me have a poll once again and let me check that if you guys want me to do the basic MVC first. Because if your guys are fresher, then should I go with MVC? Should I go with basic MVC? Okay, because most of you are actually freshers. Most of you are completely new to MVC. So there is no point in taking this advanced topic. So you tell me, basically, if you want, I can start with basic MVC. Okay, I'll start with basic MVC if you want. Guys, just let me know if you want me to start with basic MVC, because I saw that most of the people are actually new to MVC here. So let me see. Basically, see, we are having 14 people here, so I'm expecting a little bit more vote. So let's see. Oh, now it's 50-50. Now it's an issue. Okay. See, I can see only 11 votes here. I can see that 3 people are not in vote yet. So basically, we are again starting with basic MVC, because most of the crowd here don't know anything about MVC. So better we start with basic MVC. So can anybody tell me what is the difference between ASP.NET and MVC? Who work with basically? Means whatever you know. Okay, I know you don't know MVC, but still I want you to participate in this webinar. Just tell me whatever you know. What is the difference between ASP.NET and MVC? Just few points. If you want, you can unmute and speak. If you want, you can use the Q&A box and type your answer. Whatever you know. The best way of learning is participation. Okay, so just go and participate in this webinar and try to learn efficiently. I saw that couple of people already know MVC, so if they can answer something. I want to get an answer for what is the difference between ASP.NET and MVC. Whatever you know. Just means you might have saw, right, MVC. Sometime in 2008 it introduced. So far you might have heard about something MVC, right? So anyone can put some points about MVC, whatever, code behind or whatever. See, I saw that 4 people said they know MVC. Okay, lightweight MVC. Okay, so guys, MVC is model view controller. Yeah. Okay, so see pattern, separation of concerns. So guys, basically let me let me add some points about ASP.NET MVC and let me explain to you what it is. See, first of all, normally the people believe that the technology right now they are working is ASP.NET, right? Most of you believe that the one technology where you are working right now is ASP.NET MVC. Let me mute. I can hear some voice. Open source MVC. So I am unable to hear voice a bit late. Yeah. Okay. Let me mute all of you. Okay, so see, basically most of the people believe that the one technology where they are working right now is ASP.NET, like where we have a code behind concept, where we have event-driven programming, where we use grid view and server controls, right? This is what the belief is actually. Okay, but let me make you clear, there are four terminologies altogether. Okay, there is one called as ASP.NET, there is one thing called as MVC, there is one thing called as Webforms, and there is one thing called as ASP.NET MVC. Okay, so the one technology where you are working right now is not ASP.NET, it's a ASP.NET Webforms. Okay, so initially when it's long time back when web technology was the only way to develop web applications was using PHP or ASP or JSP. At that time the life of a developer was not very easy. See, now if you think about Windows application development, in Windows application development it will be very easy. What you should do is simply go and create application, drag some controls, double click that, write some code in the code behind, execute it. It will be very easy, right? So in Windows application you will be having two things, right? One is event driven programming, and second is state management. So because of these two things, the life of a developer is very easy when it comes to even Windows application development. But when you talk about web application development, it's not that easy. See, now don't think about ASP.NET Webforms where you are working right now. Okay, it works differently. Now if you think about if you take into consideration the basic web technologies like ASP, like PHP, like JSP, Ruby on Rails, or any other web technology, you know how they works. They works on request and response basis. In real life, in any web technology, there is no concept of event driven programming. There is nothing called as state management in the web development world. What we have is we have simple request and we have response. As a user, I'll always make a request and I'll always get a response. Okay, for example, if you look at here, what I'll do is I'll simply put google.com. okay, that means I'm making request to a server. Okay, and when I'll make a request to server and when I press enter, I'm getting a response. Okay, now I'll put something in this URL and I'll click the button. Now actually here there is nothing called as event driven programming. There is no code behind waiting which will get executed when I click this button. Actually what happens is when I click this button, one more request is sent to the server. Okay, one more request is sent to the server actually. So in case of web development, there is no event driven programming, there is no state management. What we have is we have request and we get response. Every time we make a request and every time we get a response. Now request may be of two types. One is get request and one is post request. Get request means, like I said google.com, give me google.com. That is a get request. And secondly, what I did, I put something in the text box, I click the enter, I click that go button. That means I'm making a post request. So when you make a get request, you will get something. When you make a post request, at that time also you will get something, but the difference will be in that situation you are also giving something to the server, like the values in the text boxes. So in simple words, in Windows application development, the life of a Windows application developer will be easier because there he will get something called as event driven programming. There he will get something called as state management. But when it comes to web development, the life is difficult because there is no event driven programming and there is no state management. Every time you put something in the text box, click the button, the value of the text box will be gone. And also there is no code behind waiting. So because there is no code behind, the life is difficult here. Okay, so Microsoft wanted to bring this event driven programming, or in simple words, Microsoft wanted to bring this word visual. Visual means where everything will be done with the help of visual things, double click, code behind, right? So Microsoft wanted to bring this event driven programming, state management kind of things in web development world. So what they did, they simply introduced something called as ASP.NET. So at that time they introduced one technology called as ASP.NET, where they wrote the one code which we used to write earlier. Okay, the one code which we used to write earlier, now they are writing it. Okay, and because of that, the this event driven programming came to picture. Okay, in reality, in web there is no event driven programming, but in ASP.NET they brought up that, because they wrote the code one we used to write earlier. Okay, they introduced many concepts in ASP.NET like view state, okay, like self post back. So with the help of these these mechanisms like self post back and view state, they brought up event driven programming in ASP.NET world. Okay, and that is the reason why ASP.NET comes to picture, because Microsoft wanted to bring that visual power in the web development world. So is there any question why ASP.NET came up first of all? Then we will talk about MVC. Is there any question? See, we are not into MVC now. I'm just trying to explain you like what is the purpose of ASP.NET. Okay. Hi Bhumi, can you just if you have any questions like whatever we discussed till now, you can go ahead. Okay, in Windows development there is event driven programming, there is state management, there is a word called as visual. In web development there is nothing like that. So in order to bring that visual word in web development, Microsoft came up with ASP.NET. What they did in ASP.NET, they simply wrote the code on behalf of us, and they brought us a feeling that there is actually a event driven programming. In reality there is no event driven programming, but we are getting a feeling that there is event driven programming. So that is the reason. So ultimately web development become easier. So any questions guys, anyone? Yeah, lost connection. Hello is I audible? See guys, if you can hear me, if you have any questions, please go ahead. Guys, see, if you have any questions, you can use this Q&A box, or you can unmute yourself and speak, okay, in case of any question. Okay, I believe nobody have any questions. Okay, so this is the point because of which ASP.NET comes to picture. Okay, so everything was automation then. So but ultimately these automation end up with some issues. Okay, like there are some problems with the ASP.NET. We'll discuss about those problems. Like in ASP.NET we have something called as grid view, we have something called as buttons. Means what we have some server controls available in ASP.NET. Guys, if you have any questions you can unmute, otherwise please keep yourself in mute, okay, because it will create some disturbances. Okay, yeah, so my point is with this ASP.NET web forms, ASP.NET means the evolution of ASP.NET, we got some benefit like the rapid application development. It just looks like Windows. So just drag some buttons, double click it, code something over there. It become very easy. But ultimately these advantages become disadvantages actually. See, in order to bring up this this event driven programming and all, Microsoft introduced view state. So unnecessarily page size increased. So unnecessarily performance issue. They introduced many server controls like grid view, text boxes, labels, buttons, many things. Okay, so what happened with those controls? See, for example, if you put a grid view, what you get? When I put any grid view in my web form, in my application, in my ASP.NET project, and when I execute it, what is the outcome? Can anybody tell me what is the outcome exactly? Yes, very good, Nitin. It is tables, right? So you are putting something and you are getting something different. Okay, and do you know one thing? If you put a label control, ASP:label control, Normally in Chrome and IE, you get span tag. But if you check the same output in Mozilla, you know what you will get? You will get label tag. Okay, if you put this ASP colon label, okay, something like this. If you put this ASP colon label in your in ASP.NET project, in Mozilla, you get something like this label. And in other browsers like Chrome and IE, you will get span. So the problem here is you don't have complete control over HTML. One, you will write something and you will get something different. Okay, you will write some server code and you will get some different HTML code. So you don't know what you are going to get. Definitely you can go and check the view source and come to know what you are going to get, but that's not real control over HTML. See, right now everybody is looking into the responsive UI, where I'll reduce the size and it should automatically get adjust. I'll increase the size and it should automatically get adjust, right? So if you want to implement such kind of UI in your project, then it is very much important that you should have control over your HTML. Okay, it will become very difficult to write any JavaScript if you don't have control over your HTML. Okay, so this is the one problem. This is one of the problem we had with this ASP.NET. Okay, we didn't had complete control, no complete control over HTML. Okay, we don't have complete control over HTML. The second problem is definitely performance. Why performance? Because Microsoft introduced view state. Because of view state, the size of the page getting increased, and because the size start getting increased, ultimately it affected the performance, right? So the third problem is unit testing difficulties. Okay, we'll not get into this unit testing, why unit testing is difficult in Webforms and all. You should understand one thing for now, because as you move further in MVC learning, okay, you will start realizing what is actually why actually unit testing is difficult. In short, what you should remember now is unit testing is difficult. Why? Because in unit testing, what we do is we invoke methods, and in code behind we have event handlers. You cannot invoke event handlers easily. Just keep that in mind. Okay, and the one more biggest disadvantage of unit testing, this web form is reusability. Let me put you one point in front of you. Let's say I have a UI. Okay, let's say I have a UI. Okay, that means definitely I will be having a code behind, right? So one in ASP.NET, one UI means one ASPX and one ASPX.cs. That means one design page and one code behind page, right? Now my question is, let's say I have one more UI. Okay, now you tell me, is it possible for me to use the same code behind for that UI as well? Is it possible for me? Is my question clear? My question is it possible to reuse the same code behind between two UIs? Guys, you can use the Q&A box. Just think about it, guys. Just think about it. I want more answers. Okay, I can see that only Nitin is answering. See guys, if you really want to learn MVC, then you should make this session more and more interactive. Oh, very good. At least you are participating. No, see, okay, let me give you a hint. Okay, basically you might have heard about see how your ASPX exactly looks like this, right? There will be percentage, there will be page, there will be something called as code behind, right? Like this code behind, where you will put a URL of something .aspx.cs, right? Then you will be having you will be having a attribute called as inherits, where you will put a class name, right? So don't you think that I can simply go and put this change this code behind and inherits, and I'll be able to reuse two code behinds in one UI? So are you getting what I'm saying? So what I mean to say is simply go and change the page attribute, and by that what you can do is you can reuse two code behinds in single UI. One code behind two UIs, I mean to say, sorry. So now you tell me, is it possible to reuse a single code behind for multiple UIs? Yes or no? You getting, guys? It's possible, right? Okay, Dipesh is still saying no. Oh, can you guys tell me why no? I proved it, right? It's possible now. See, as the ASP.NET web form developer, what you can do is simply go to your ASPX page, simply find that @page directive, and simply change your code behind to the one you want to use. So that means one code behind will be used between multiple, right? You tried. So is it working, Nitin? Basically it should work, right? Logically it should work. Forget about MVC. Forget about MVC. We are not in, I don't know MVC, okay? There is nothing called as MVC in this world. There is nothing called as MVC in this world. We have only ASP.NET. Now we are into 2000 era, okay? 2000. Today is 18 December 2000, okay? Just today Webform ASP.NET is introduced, and the basic idea behind introduction to ASP.NET is Microsoft wanted to bring rapid application development in the web development world, because with ASP.NET they brought up event driven programming, view state management. They made everything easier, so everything is developing quickly now. So we can have, but there would be conflict with different events. That's fine, right? Means how it will be. See, now I'll tell you, I'll give you a hint. Let's say I have a UI, and in this UI I have one grid view, okay, and I have one drop down, let's say, okay. So in the code behind I'll be having two things, okay. I'll be having one code which will simply bind grid view to data source. Okay, are you getting? I have one UI which contain one grid view and one drop down. So in the code behind, I'll create one function, or I'll write one code block which will bind my drop down grid view with some data. So, and I will be having second method. I also have second method which will bind my drop down to grid view. Are you getting, guys? Everyone? This method will bind drop down to some, this method will bind my grid views to some data source, and this method will bind my drop down to some data source. Okay, now let's say I have another UI where I'm going to have the same grid view. So basically as an object oriented programmer, I should not repeat this code. So what I should do, I should use the same code behind here. So I'll do that. I'll go to the UI ASPX of this page. I'll simply change the code behind attribute to this code behind file, right? So now what I'll do, this is a.aspx. This is a.aspx.cs. This a is attached to this a.aspx.cs. Now this is b.aspx, and this b.aspx is also attached to a.aspx.cs. This is possible. So if I press F5, what will happen? Can anybody tell me? If I press F5 now, what will happen? Just think about it, guys. If I press F5 now, what will happen? Is my question clear? Basically, page compile, yeah, page compile means yes, definitely, but will it compile? Okay, I'll change inherit also. Okay, but will it work now? If I press F5, will it work or no? You got it right. Basically, in one grid view, one UI, I have one drop down and one grid view. In another UI, I have only grid view. And in code behind of first UI, what I'll do is I'll write two functions, one which will bind the grid view, one which will bind the drop down. Now I have attached that code behind to that UI. So in that case, will it compile? It will give you compile error. Will be compiled with each page having its common code behind? No, it will give you compile error. You know why? The reason is because this UI is attached to this code behind. That means now when it try to compile, here you have one code block which contain reference to drop down. Because it contain reference to drop down, it will say in the UI there is no drop down, so there will not be any compilation. So it will throw compile error. Are you getting, guys? Because in one UI we have two controls. So this code behind contain reference of both the code behinds, right? One code which will bind this grid view and one code which will bind this drop down. But when I attach this to here, when these two get combined, it will not work because this is not here. So I should remove it from here. If I remove it from here, it will not work for him. So in either case, either it will work for this or either it will work for this. So are you getting, guys, everyone? Okay, sorry, then. Got it, right? So basically compilation will not work. Compilation will work if all of the controls are same in both the pages, which doesn't make sense at all. So my point is, here code behind logic is not reusable. You cannot reuse single code behind logic between multiple UIs. So that is the point. So what I mean to say is, I say reusability is the issue here. Okay, so these are some of the issues which we had with the ASP.NET. Okay, let me come up with it again. I said in Windows development we had a concept of visual. So because of that, event-driven programming was there. Because of that, state management was there. Because of that, development life was easier. So Microsoft wanted to get that power in web development world. That's why they came up with a concept called as ASP.NET, where they introduced something called as view state, self-postback, and ultimately they came up with event-driven programming, server controls, and these features which increased the development time, which affected the development time. It introduced rapid application development. Application development will be fast. You can develop something very quickly. Will ultimately leads to some issues like there is no complete control over HTML. So if you want to develop something responsive UI, it will be very difficult. You cannot reuse the code behind. Performance will be less. So these are the issues with ASP.NET. Okay, and Microsoft wanted to find a solution for this. So they said, let's introduce a new technology. Okay, they said, let's introduce new technologies to solve this problem. And they suddenly realizes that now ASP.NET also belongs to them. ASP.NET also belongs to them. So why should we create new technology from scratch? Why don't we create something in such a way that it is going to be the part of ASP.NET? They said, let's create something not from the scratch. Let's create something and let's reuse some of the feature from ASP.NET. Are you getting? They didn't introduce some new technology. They introduced a new flavor of it. Okay, so what they did, they said, let's introduce a new flavor. Let's call that flavor as XYZ. Now this XYZ is a flavor of ASP.NET. Now try to understand one thing, guys. Now here we have a couple of attendees, right? Around 15 attendees. Okay, now let's say I am the only human being in this entire world. So I'll be called as human. Remember, okay, everybody will call me as human, right? If the laptop which I have right now is the only laptop in this world, then we usually call it as laptop. But right now there are many laptops, so we cannot call them as laptop. I'll say this is Dell laptop with so and so serial number. His name is Sukesh Marla. His name is Pradeep Sheth. Whatever. Are you getting? So everybody is having some name. So when Microsoft came up with an idea of introducing one more flavor of ASP.NET technology, they realized that now they cannot call this as ASP.NET anymore. They should call it something different now. Though they said now the one technology which they had earlier is something we call it as ASP.NET Webforms. It's not ASP.NET. That was ASP.NET Webforms. So the one technology where you are working right now, which contain code behind, which contain server controls, which contain event-driven programming, which contain view state, is ASP.NET Webforms. It's not ASP.NET. It's not ASP.NET. ASP.NET is a higher level technology which has two flavors in it. One is a web form where you are working right now, and one is the new one which they introduced just now. Okay, so let's see what that new one is. That is the first point. Okay, they said we are going to introduce something new, so why should we create it from scratch? Let's reuse it. Let's reuse the ASP.NET and create it. So they said whatever we are going to create, that is going to be ASP.NET XYZ. Got it? So the earlier one which they had is ASP.NET Webforms. ASP.NET is a higher level framework which contain all the DLLs. Okay, now ASP.NET Webforms is a part of ASP.NET. And the newer one which they are going to introduce, which will solve these problems, they will call it ASP.NET XYZ. Okay, now they said, see, anyways, we are going to introduce something new. So why don't we introduce something in such a way that it is built on something which is already proven, like MVC architecture. MVC architecture is there from long time in market. Already you will see that Java people are using it. Even recently Android is using MVC, iOS is using MVC. Okay, in many technology MVC architecture is already implemented. So Microsoft said, let's make our new technology based on MVC architecture, and they introduced ASP.NET MVC. So in short, altogether there are 4 terminologies. One is ASP.NET, which is a higher level technology. One is MVC, which is nothing but it's an architectural pattern. Architectural pattern means what? Architectural pattern is something which will define how your project should be structured. Like what all folders should be there, each folder what it will contain, how each component of that architecture will talk to each other. So in short, MVC is an architectural pattern which is there. It says your project should be divided into model, view and controller. Controller will talk to view and whatever. Okay. MVC and Webforms, ASP.NET MVC and ASP.NET Webforms. These are 2 flavors of ASP.NET. Just like pizza. Pizza is there and there are multiple flavors of pizza. ASP.NET is one higher level technology. It contains 2 flavors. One is ASP.NET Webforms and one is ASP.NET MVC. ASP.NET Webforms follow that code behind approach, where there will be button, where there will be state management, where there will be view state, whereas ASP.NET MVC follows controller approach. We'll talk about that later. Any question, guys? Understanding why ASP.NET MVC came up. So in ASP.NET MVC, all those problems solved, because there is no code behind. So ultimately everything gets solved in simple words. We'll do practical and you'll realize more. Any questions, guys? Is it clear, everyone? Is it clear, everyone? Any questions? Good. So now what we will do is, we said ASP.NET MVC, and ASP.NET MVC is based on ASP.NET and MVC architecture. Yes, we'll talk about that. Don't worry. I'll explain it to you why. Yes, MVC is an architectural, Rupesh. MVC is an architectural pattern. ASP.NET is a framework. Okay. Now, as I said, now ASP.NET MVC is based on ASP.NET technology, ASP.NET framework and MVC architecture. So what exactly it is? So let's create a project and let's try to understand that. Okay. What I'll do is I'll say web and I'll say MVC for application. Okay. I'll say, let's say webinar. Okay. I'll say, okay. Now you will see that when I say create MVC for project, okay, it is giving me a couple of templates. Let's not get into these templates, what they are. Let's not get into that. What is this view engine and unit test? Okay. When maybe in some of the future, okay, some of the future webinars, considering that by that time you will learn MVC and come. Okay. So we'll discuss about these templates in detail. For now, I'll take this empty. I'll say, okay. Now, as soon as I create this MVC project, you'll see that in the solution explorer, you will find couple of folders will be created automatically. Okay, you'll see couple of folders will be created automatically. See here, can you see? It contains 3 folders: model, views and controllers, right? Each one of, so that's why it is MVC. MVC architecture says there should be 3 things: model, views and controller. And it decides how each one of them will talk to each other. That's what we will understand now. Don't worry. Okay, so we will start with understanding controllers first. So this is how we will create a new project, and now let's go and create a controller and let's try to understand exactly how this controller works and what is the purpose of controller in MVC. Okay, first let me create a controller. I'll say right click, add new controller. Okay, as you can see in the dialog box, only default one is selected. Why? Because MVC, as I said, it will define everything. Like it will define how your project should be structured, how it should be named and everything. Okay, it is also called as a convention based approach because it will decide how you should name the things and where you should keep the things. And it says every controller should have a suffix called as default one. Okay, it should always contain default a controller at the end. It is must. So I'll say test. So in this case, the name of my controller is test. Okay. When I say add, you will see that it will create a new class. Okay, it will create a new class called test controller. Okay, the name of this class is test controller, and the name of my controller is test. Remember, okay, always remember, if someone asks you during interviews or anywhere, what is the name of your controller, it's not test controller, it's just test. Every class which will inherit from controller base class and which will contain controller as the keyword at the ending, these two rules, okay, every class which will inherit from controller base class and which will contain this controller keyword at the ending will be your controller automatically. It will automatically become your controller. Now this is the first component of your MVC, and it is the first component of your ASP.NET MVC as well. What it will do? Simple. Okay, MVC, ASP in MVC, controller is the first component. As I said, it will handle user interaction logic. What is mean by user interaction logic? See, I'll go here, I'll type google.com, I'll press enter. That means as an end user, I am doing something. And as an end user, when I do something, in the server, in the Google server, there is a logic written which will handle my request and which will do something. Okay. And that logic is called as user interaction logic. And that logic will be written inside controller in case of MVC. When I press enter, controller handle the request and it will give me some response. So simple word, controller means user interaction logic. That's it. Okay. And inside this controller, what we do is we create public methods, and these public methods, we call it as action methods. So in real life scenario, end user will make request to a method of a class. That method is called as action method and that class is called as controller. That action methods actually handle the user interaction logic. So I'll create a simple method. I'll say get string. I'll say return Sukesh, or I'll say Mumbai Techie Group. Done. Are you getting? So as an end user, I will make a request to this get string method of test controller class. Forget about view, forget about model, everything. Right now you know only one thing, that is controller, which will handle the user interaction. User will put something in the URL, press enter, that will be handled by one of the action method inside the controller class. User will click the button, that will be handled by one of the action method in the controller class. Everything which will be done by user, that will be handled by the controller's action method. So let me press F5. And in the URL, I'll simply put one thing, that is /, I'll put test. Now test is nothing but name of my controller. Okay. And / I'll say get string, enter. Now get string is nothing but it's the name of my method. So user will make a request to a method of a class, that is action method of a controller, and as a response he will get this string. Okay. Now if you check the view source, see, it's not HTML, it's string. If you remember, in case of ASP.NET Webforms, now don't say ASP.NET, okay, the one where you're working right now is ASP.NET Webforms. It's not ASP, it's not ASP.NET. You should call it as ASP.NET Webforms. I'm sorry. Okay. So in ASP.NET Webforms, you make a request and you get a response, but response will be HTML always. If you check the view source of your ASPX, it will always be HTML. Try to create a simple application, execute it, check the view source, it will be HTML. But here, as you can see, it's not HTML, it's pure string. So it doesn't matter. End user will make a request to action method, he will get something. So that's it. It is all about controllers in ASP.NET MVC. Is it clear, everyone? Any question, guys? Anyone about controller? Don't talk about views, don't talk about action methods, nothing. I'll explain it to you why it is lightweight. Any questions, guys? Anyone? Use this Q&A box if you have any questions, okay? Yes, you should not say we display, we return. Okay, see, when you go for interview, when you appear for any interview, in that case it is very important your terminologies. Okay, so you should say, should I return? Can I return? Okay, you should not say can I display. In ASPX page also, you are not displaying anything, you are returning. Okay, and user is seeing that. Okay, is nothing but business logic layer? No, Mangesh, no. It is user interaction logic. There is difference between business layer and user interaction logic, right? Try to understand what I'm saying. Controller will handle the user interaction logic. User interaction logic means whatever user will do, that will be handled by controller. You put something in the URL, press enter, that will be handled by controller. You click the button, that will be handled by the controller. Your business layer logic will be written somewhere else. We'll talk about that later. Controller means only user interaction logic. User's request will be handled by controller. Clear, everyone? Any questions, please go and ask. Okay, any questions, please go and ask. Any questions, guys? Great. So now this is action method, and we are making a request. Okay, now as you can, what we did is we put something in the URL, press enter, we came here. Similarly, what will happen, if you click some button, it will come here only. We'll see that later. Okay, now in real life, we are never going to ask user to put something in the URL and he will get string, right? In the real life, he will be getting some UI where there will be some images, there will be some buttons, there will be some text boxes, right? So using which you can do something, right? So in real life, he will be required a design, and that's where the second part of MVC comes to picture, that is views. So it's not like web forms. Okay, here views means pure design. There will not be any kind of code behind attached to it. In MVC, okay, I'll tell you something. In web forms, what you have page, which consists of ASPX plus ASPX.cs. In ASP.NET MVC, don't call it MVC. Okay, in ASP.NET MVC, you have differently view, which will act as your ASPX page, and you have controller, which will act as your ASPX.cs. Okay, your page is broken down into two things. One is view, which is containing design, and one is controller, which will contain your user interaction logic. Now try to understand. In MVC, in ASP.NET Web Form, your user interaction logic will be handled by controllers. Sorry. In web forms, it will be handled by code behind. You click the button, event handler will be in the code behind. You make any request, always page load will execute it. So in ASP.NET Web Forms, user interaction logic will be executed by or will be handled by code behind. Here it will be handled by controller. Now, as I said, here the page is broken down into views and controller. Now, how it is different? Here also we have two files, there also we have two files. Let's see how it is different then. So now what I'll do, I'll create one more action method. I'll say public action result. What is this action result? Let's try to understand later. I'll say get view. Okay, and I'll write a simple line, return view. I'll say my first view. Okay, now what I'll do, I'll simply right click this action method. I'll say add view. Remember, I should right click this action method and say add view. And here in the right side in the solution explorer, if you expand this views folder, you will see that it is empty right now. Okay, I'll right click this action method. I'll say add view, and I'll simply put it as my first view. And after that, I'll uncheck this checkbox. See, all these things, just ignore it for now. Okay, we'll talk about it maybe in one of the next seminar. Okay, what I did, I'll right click this action method. I'll say add view, and I'll put get view name as my first view, and I'll uncheck this user layout or master page, and I'll say add. Now you'll see that as soon as I do click on this add, you'll see a strange thing. You'll see that a new folder will be get created inside this views folder with a new file. See, I'll say add. See here, a new folder get created. The name of that folder is nothing but your controller folder, and the whatever you name you put over there, my first view, is here now. It's a UI now. I'll say hello world. Clear? Got it? So now I'll put a breakpoint here. I'll press F5. I'll say slash test slash get string. Oh, sorry. Get view. Enter. See, I'm here. Now what it will do, it will say simply return this my first view. I'll press F5. See, I got it. Right? Here, things are a little bit different. In Webforms, we actually make a request to something which is there in the system. I mean to say, in ASP.NET Webforms, we will request for something which is really there in the system, like ASPX files, and it will be returned to the user. But here we will make a request to something which is not there in the system, because like methods, action methods, we are making request to action methods, and that action method returns something. Here that this action method is returning this view. Okay, simple view. This view is not connected to controller. If you want, you can return anything, right? Whatever name you will put it, that view will get it. So there is no connection between here. It's loosely coupled. So any confusion understanding what is the difference? What is this view? Clear, guys? So we understood what exactly is view. View is design. It is loosely coupled. And if you check this view, there is no server control available here. There is no server control available like grid view, text box, drop down, button. What you have to do is use the pure HTML and develop the system. If you are using pure HTML, you don't have option to put server controls. That means you will ultimately get full control over HTML. There is no code behind. See, there is no code behind here. Can you see it? No. That means ultimately reusability is there because controller is a simple class, so you can reuse it. View state is not there, so ultimately you will get a performance, right? See guys, it is very must, okay? Learning MVC is very must now, okay? Because see, life of now this ASP.NET Webforms will not be there for long time, okay? Maybe 1 or 2 year max to max. After that, you will not see ASP.NET Webforms anywhere, okay? ASP.NET MVC will be there everywhere. So try to learn ASP.NET MVC because it's very important. Okay, so any questions about controller and view? If you have any questions, please go and ask. That we will that I'll explain it to you, don't worry. Any questions about controllers and views? Any questions about controllers and views? Okay, so now let's try to understand what exactly is this action result. Now action result, try to understand. Action result, result of a action, result of a action method. When user make a request, it will be handled by whom? It will be handled by action method. And that action method will return action result. The result of an action method is called as action result. Okay, the action result is nothing but it's the result which end user will get. Okay, end user will get action result always as a response. Okay, in ASP.NET MVC, end user will always get action result as response. Clear, everyone? Now what is this view? This view is nothing but it's a function. See, I'm putting it bracket, right? Customer, I'll say get customer. What I'll do, I'll put a bracket, right? So it is a function. View is a function. So where does it define? It is defined inside this controller class. If I say right click and go to definition, you will see that, see, it is defined here. Okay, it is defined here. Okay, where? In the, see here, controller class. Okay, you can't see the source code definitely. So controller class. What this view is a function which is defined inside this controller base class. What it will do, it will simply return the view result. Try to understand. Action result means result of an action which end user will get. End user will always make a request to action method and he will always get a response. The response which he get is called as an action result. Now action result may be of many types. Are you getting? For example, we go to hotel and we ask for a food. So when we go to hotel, the response is always food. So food is the result of the hotel, we can say, right? Now in reality, the food may be of many types: masala dosa, pav bhaji, this, that, many, right? So what I'm trying to explain you is, food is one and it will be having many types. Similarly, action result is the one which end user will get, and action result will be containing, so there will be many kind of action results, and one of them is view result. View result means user will get HTML in response. Okay, maybe in future we'll talk about more action results. So view function will return view result of this view. What is view result? This is a view, right? It will return simply HTML of it. This HTML it will return to end user. So whatever name you put, so what does this view function will do exactly? This view function will try to find a view. This view function will try to find a view which is located inside views / current controller folder / this whatever argument .cshtml. Okay, it will try to find this view and it will return that view. Clear everyone? Let me repeat. This view function, what it will do, it will simply return it will simply try to find the view which is located inside which is located inside views / current controller name, that is test / argument.chhtml. It will try to find that. When it find that, it will simply return that to end user. That's what this view function will do. Okay, clear everyone? This is what a view function will do. So any questions till now? Any question, guys? Any question, guys, or should I proceed? So every time we have to mention action result keyword. Okay, see, basically it's not required to return action result here. As I said, if you want, you can return a string also, or you can return a view result also. Okay, or if you want, you can put a view result also, straightforward like this, then also it will work. Okay, now basically why we should put action result, the reason for that is, let's say you go to hotel and hotel says we give you masala dosa. That means what? You will get only masala dosa there. Are you getting? Hotel says we will give you masala dosa. That means you will get only masala dosa over there. If hotel says we will give you food, that means they will be able to give you anything. So when you put action result, the best point here is you will be able to return any action result. Like right now we are returning view result, but in some case we can return something else also. It's web. Okay, it's web application. Okay, so any more question? Okay, so this is about controller and views. Let's do a small thing once again. Let's do one more small thing and then we will finish out today. Okay, now this view which we created here is a little bit static. We need to display some dynamic data here, right? And that's where models comes to picture. Models means nothing but, in simple words, model is business data and business logic. Okay, it contain, I'll right click this model folder. This is simple classes. Okay, it is not technical. I'll say class. I'll create a simple class here, customer add. Okay, we have created a new customer class here. Now here what I'll do is I'll create some properties. I'll say property string customer name, and I'll create one more property. I'll say property string, I'll call it as address. Okay, now this is your model. Okay, that's it. Now what I'll do, I'll go to controller, and here what I'll do, I'll say create a customer class. Okay, we need to put a using statement. Customer C equal to new customer class. Assign values to its properties. I'll say customer 1, and I'll say C dot address is equal to address 1. Okay, and now I want to pass this C to this view. basically. Okay, I have data with me. Okay, data means your model. Data means your model. Just take it like that. Data means your model. Okay, now I have this customer class here, and my requirement is I want to pass this customer data to this view. Now try to understand one thing. Yeah, well, there is one question. Let me see. What should I do? You lost connection. Okay. See that I can't do anything, right? If you lost the connection, right? See, I was saying that this is my model, this is my data, and I want to transfer this data to my view. So first, what I'll do, I'll go to my view and I'll make it a strongly typed view. Okay, I'll talk about strongly typed view. I'll simply put @. It's a syntax. Okay, don't worry about the syntaxes. Once you practice it, you will get used to with it. I'll say model space and I'll type customer. That means once you write this line inside view, you can write this line only once. Okay, you can write this line only once. That means this view is a strongly typed view of type customer. Once you put this line, you will call this view as a strongly typed view of type customer. Okay guys, this view is a strongly typed view of type customer, and when view is a strongly typed view, it can get data directly. Okay, so what you can do is you can directly pass this comma C, and this C will come to this view automatically. Okay, and how to access that object here? You should say again capital @ and you should write capital M and model. Okay, small m means make it strongly typed view, capital M means this one. I'll say dot customer name. Can you see it? Okay, I'll say hello world capital model dot customer name. Similarly, if you want, you can access the customer address as well. Others can hear you, hear me, Bhumi. That means that might be the reason with your internet connection. Please check it once. Okay, I can see that there is no mic symbol here. Okay, so I'll execute it. I'll put a breakpoint here. I'll put a breakpoint here, and I'll say test/get view. I'll say refresh. I'm here. So now I'll press F10, F10, F10. So I created my customer view. Okay. Now I'm passing this customer model. I am passing this customer model to my first view. So I'll press F10, and you'll see that it will be, see, it came here. I'll press F10. It will display here. I'll press F5. See, customer 1. So that is the 3 parts of my ASP.NET MVC. Controller means it will handle the user interaction, view means design, and model means business data. Okay, business data, business logic, whatever you guys call it. Okay, so that will be displayed here, and this is about ASP.NET MVC. So any questions? No, you cannot. You cannot have multiple models, but you can have view model, and that's what I was talking about today. That's what I want to talk today. But I found that most of the, actually more than 60-70% guys are actually completely new to ASP.NET MVC, so that's why I started with this one. No, this is basic MVC. Okay, you cannot multiple models you cannot use. But good question, Ajinkya, very good. Okay, and guys, I'm telling you, please learn MVC, otherwise it will become very difficult for you to get into job later. So any more questions about ASP.NET MVC, or we will end for the day? So hope you enjoyed it. Okay.